Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive into some 6th century philosophy? We're going deep into the world of David, a philosopher who's a bit of a mystery, even to scholars.
A mysterious figure from a fascinating era. 6th century Byzantium, the later years of philosophical commentary on some of the big names, Plato, Aristotle.
Right, like we're catching the end of an era. But that's where David comes in. The thing is, we only have a handful of works by him, and we're not even completely sure who he was.
Exactly. Even his actual identity is a bit up for debate.
It's a puzzle, for sure. Some scholars even suggest that he could be the same person as David the Invincible, an Armenian theologian.
That's one of the theories out there.
And here's another layer, to make it even more interesting. His philosophy is packed with ideas that seem really pagan, like the world is eternal, the soul is immortal, things like that.
All very reminiscent of ancient Greek thought.
Yeah, it's like taking a step back in time. But, and this is the real head-scratcher, he's often considered a Christian philosopher. So how do we square that circle? How do we reconcile these ideas that seem to be pulling in different directions? That's what we're going to unpack today.
It's a really great example of how complex this period was. The lines between different schools of thought weren't always so clear-cut.
Okay, so let's get down to the nuts and bolts. What do we actually have from David? What texts are we working with?
Well, there are two main texts that have survived. The first is his Prolegomena Philosophiae, which, if you don't speak ancient Greek, means Introduction to Philosophy.
Sounds pretty straightforward.
Well, it's structured as a series of 24 lectures called praxis, and these introductions were becoming, well, much more elaborate in Alexandria at the time.
You mean they weren't just quick summaries anymore?
Exactly. David's, for example, is actually 4 times longer than Ammonius's, who was an earlier philosopher.
So these introductions were turning into substantial works in themselves.
Wow. Okay, and what about the second text? That one is a collection of lectures on Porphyry's introduction to Aristotle's categories.
Porphyry, remind me, where does he fit into all of this?
Porphyry was a big name in Neoplatonism, active in the 3rd century. He was really influential in starting this whole tradition of writing commentaries on Aristotle.
Gotcha. So David's commentary is kind of like an interpretation of an interpretation.
You could say that. So Porphyry's introduction was meant as a guide to Aristotle's categories. It deals with some pretty fundamental concepts in logic and ontology.
Okay, when you say categories, you're not talking about like sorting your socks, right?
Not quite. Aristotle was looking into the basic ways that we understand and classify being. Things like genus, species, differentia. Really the building blocks of how we think, logically and metaphysically.
Right, the very structure of our thinking about the world.
Exactly. And for David, Porphyry's work was crucial. He thought if you wanted to study philosophy at all, you needed to understand these categories.
Like laying the foundation before you build the house.
A great analogy.
Okay, so we've got these 2 key texts, but just to add to the mystery, David also mentions writing commentaries on other works by Aristotle, which unfortunately haven't survived.
Lost to time. It's always a shame when that happens.
A real philosophical treasure hunt waiting to happen. But let's get to the juicy stuff. David's work is full of these seemingly pagan ideas we mentioned earlier, the eternal world, the immortal soul, all that.
And it's not just the ideas themselves. There's this quote right at the beginning of the Prolegomena that I always find so striking. David talks about the intense love of philosophical arguments as a kind of madness. He even uses a quote from Homer to get his point across.
Homer, the poet. That's not who I would expect a philosopher, especially one who's often labeled Christian, to be quoting.
It just goes to show you that these boundaries, these categories we think of, they weren't as rigid back then. But what's so interesting to me is that David is saying that philosophy isn't just like an intellectual game. It's something much deeper, a real passionate pursuit of truth, almost like a divine inspiration.
So he's elevating philosophy, making it a kind of spiritual experience.
Exactly. That's what I find so fascinating. He's pulling together all these different threads, the philosophical, the spiritual, even the poetic.
Which brings us back to that big question. How could someone who writes like this, with such a clear appreciation for what we might call pagan ideas, be considered a Christian philosopher? That seems like a contradiction.
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's one of the main debates about David. The thing is, during late antiquity, religious and philosophical identities, they were much more fluid than we might think today.
So we can't really look at it through our modern lens.
Right, it wasn't always a simple this or that situation. One theory is that David was trying to find a way to bridge the gap, to find common ground between pagan and Christian thought.
almost like a philosophical peace treaty.
That's a good way to put it. And this raises another question. Did he see Christianity as fulfilling or transforming certain aspects of pagan philosophy? Or was there something else going on, something more intricate?
That's a really interesting question to consider. It challenges us to look more closely, to think about the nuances of David's thought, and to question our own assumptions about how these different intellectual traditions relate to each other.
Exactly. And it highlights the real challenges that historians of philosophy face
Yeah.
when trying to understand this period. It's like trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. It really is. It reminds us that studying history and philosophy, it's not always about finding clear-cut answers. Sometimes it's about embracing the ambiguity, wrestling with those complexities.
Totally. Now, I'm curious about the content itself, the philosophical meat of it all. We touched on this idea that for David, philosophy was this transformative experience, almost like a spiritual journey. But how does that actually play out in his philosophical system? What specific concepts or arguments reflect this approach?
Well, one area where this really shines through is in his cosmology. That's how he understood the structure and nature of the universe. He's drawing a lot from Plato and the Neoplatonists, emphasizing this idea of a hierarchical order of reality, with the divine realm at the top and the material world down at the bottom.
So he's not picturing the cosmos as just like a random jumble of stuff. It's a structured, meaningful whole. There's purpose, direction.
Exactly. And for David, getting a grasp on this cosmic order wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was like a path to spiritual enlightenment, aligning yourself with the divine will.
Like tuning into the cosmic frequency.
That's a great way to put it. And this alignment with the divine, it wasn't just about passive contemplation either. It had ethical implications, guiding how we act, the choices we make.
So philosophy for David wasn't just theoretical. It was about living in harmony with his cosmic order, making decisions that reflect an understanding of the true nature of reality.
Absolutely. And this focus on ethics is another place where we see that blend of pagan and Christian influences. He talks about classical virtues like wisdom, justice, temperance. But he also brings in Christian concepts like love and charity.
It's like he's creating a kind of ethical fusion, drawing from both classical philosophy and Christian theology to show a path to the good life.
That's a great observation. And that's what makes studying David so fascinating. He's not just repeating old ideas. He's really engaging with different intellectual traditions, trying to create something new and meaningful out of them.
This idea of synthesis, bringing different strands of thought together, that really speaks to me. It's like intellectual growth isn't about sticking rigidly to one school of thought. It's about opening yourself up to different perspectives, learning from them all, and ultimately creating something new and unique.
Couldn't agree more, and I think that's a great lesson for anyone interested in philosophy, really, whether you're digging into ancient texts or grappling with contemporary issues. It's all about that ongoing dialogue, that back and forth between different ideas and viewpoints.
Speaking of dialogue and different viewpoints, let's get back to this whole question of authorship. All these conflicting attributions in the manuscripts, it makes you wonder about how we even understand authorship in the ancient world. It wasn't as straightforward as we might think, right?
Yeah, right. It really challenges those modern ideas we have about what it means to be an author. In the ancient world, texts were often, well, more fluid, more collaborative. They were copied, recopied, edited, adapted, and sometimes the original author's name just got lost along the way.
It's like those medieval manuscripts where you see little doodles and comments scribbled in the margins by different scribes. It shows you that these texts were living, breathing things, constantly being reinterpreted and reshaped.
Exactly. And that fluidity makes it so much harder to pinpoint the real origins and intentions of a text.
So how do historians of philosophy even begin to untangle this kind of textual mess?
It's incredibly meticulous work, very detail-oriented. It involves comparing different manuscripts, analyzing the language, the style, looking for any hints about the author's background and influences. It's like being a detective, piecing together all these fragments of evidence to try and reconstruct the past.
Sounds like a tough job, but I bet it's rewarding.
It definitely is, and even if we can't definitively crack the case, so to speak, the investigation itself can lead to amazing discoveries.
So with David, even if we never know for sure who he really was, the process of asking these questions helps us understand the intellectual world he lived in, that complex web of ideas.
Exactly. It deepens our appreciation for the sheer variety and richness of thought in late antiquity.
This whole discussion has really got me thinking about how important context is when we're trying to understand philosophical texts. It's not just about reading the words on the page. We need to try to imagine the world those words were written in, the historical, cultural, and intellectual landscape.
Absolutely crucial, and especially important when dealing with texts from a time like late antiquity, a period that's often misunderstood. It's easy to project our own modern assumptions onto these texts, but that can really distort their original meaning and significance.
So how do we avoid that trap? How do we approach these texts with the right kind of historical sensitivity?
It takes a combination of solid scholarship, intellectual humility, and a willingness to be okay with ambiguity. We have to recognize that we might never have all the answers, and that's all right. It's the process of inquiry, the journey itself that's valuable, even if it doesn't lead to neat and tidy conclusions.
That's such a good point. It reminds us that intellectual humility is just as important as intellectual curiosity.
We need to be open to the possibility that our understanding of the past is always evolving, always subject to change as new evidence pops up and new interpretations are offered.
That's what keeps history and philosophy so interesting. It's not about memorizing a bunch of facts. It's about this ongoing conversation with the past.
It's a conversation that can really enrich our understanding of ourselves, our world, and the power that ideas have, even across centuries.
And that brings me to something that really struck me. The fact that David's work, even with all the uncertainty around who he was and the context he was writing in, it still fascinates people today. Scholars, students of philosophy, it continues to draw them in.
It's a real testament to the timeless questions he tackled, questions about what is reality, what does it mean to be human, what is the relationship between faith and reason. These are questions that have always been with us, and they continue to challenge and inspire us.
And even though David's answers might be rooted in his specific historical moment, there's something in them that transcends time and place.
Exactly. They remind us that the search for wisdom, it's an ongoing journey, one that connects us across centuries to those thinkers who came before us.
Okay, so we've explored this mysterious world of David's, looking at the texts that remain, pondering his unknown identity, wrestling with the intricacies of his philosophical ideas. But before we wrap up, I want to revisit something you said earlier. You mentioned that David's work makes us question those assumptions we have about how paganism and Christianity related to each other in late antiquity.
Yeah, it challenges that oversimplified view that we often see, that idea of just stark opposition and conflict between them.
All right, it's like we're being invited to look beyond the stereotypes and see the nuances, those gray areas where these two worldviews, seemingly so different, might have actually been interacting in much more complex ways.
Exactly. And that's one of the most valuable things about digging into these texts from the past. They force us to think outside of our own boxes, to recognize that our categories and understandings, they're shaped by our own time and place.
So how do we start to reframe our understanding of this relationship, the relationship between paganism and Christianity in late antiquity? Where do we even begin?
Well, I think it starts by recognizing that both paganism and Christianity, they're very broad categories. They cover a huge range of beliefs and practices.
So it's not just a simple this or that, a black and white division.
Not at all. There was a lot of diversity of thought and practice within both paganism and Christianity, and importantly, there was interaction, there was exchange between them.
Like those philosophical introductions we were talking about before. Remember, David's Prolegomena is way longer than Ammonius's. That points to this trend of increasing complexity, this fusion of ideas that was happening.
Exactly. And don't forget, David even quotes Homer in his philosophical arguments. That kind of cross-pollination suggests a much more fluid intellectual landscape than we often imagine.
So instead of seeing these two traditions locked in some kind of battle to the death, maybe we should picture them existing in a more dynamic, porous relationship.
Exactly. They influenced each other, they borrowed from each other, and sometimes they even merged in surprising ways.
Okay, that helps to paint a more nuanced picture. But I'm still trying to wrap my head around how David fits into all of this. He seems to be drawing heavily on these pagan philosophical concepts, and yet he's often considered a Christian philosopher. How do we square those two things?
Well, it's possible that David saw Christianity as offering a new perspective, a new way to interpret and understand those pagan philosophical concepts. Maybe he thought certain aspects of pagan thought could be integrated into a Christian worldview, making it richer and deeper.
So instead of seeing Christianity as rejecting or overturning pagan philosophy, maybe he saw it as fulfilling his potential in a new way.
Exactly. It's a really intriguing possibility. And it raises questions about how new religious ideas interact with those existing intellectual traditions.
And I'm also thinking about the bigger picture, the historical context. We're talking about 6th century Byzantium, a time of huge change, a lot of upheaval. The Roman Empire is falling apart. Christianity is on the rise. Maybe David's work reflects this attempt to make sense of it all, this changing world, to find a way to bridge the old and the new.
That's a really perceptive point. It's very likely that David, like many thinkers of his time, was grappling with the implications of these enormous shifts happening in the political and religious landscape. His philosophy might have been a way to navigate those uncertainties, to try to find a way forward in the midst of all the chaos.
It makes you realize that philosophy isn't just this abstract thing. It's really connected to what's going on in the world, socially, politically, religiously.
You're absolutely right. And when we understand the context, the historical backdrop of a philosopher's life and work, we can get a much deeper appreciation for why they thought the way they did, the challenges they faced, and why their ideas matter.
So it's like, when we try to understand David, we're not just learning about one philosopher from long ago. We're getting a glimpse into a pivotal point in history, a time when the world was transforming and new ideas were emerging that would have a massive impact on the course of Western civilization.
That's a powerful way to put it. It underscores why studying the history of philosophy is so important, not just for its own sake, but for what it tells us about the broader story of humanity, the enduring power of ideas.
It makes you realize that the past isn't really past at all. It's still shaping us in ways we might not even realize.
Couldn't agree more. Those echoes of the past, they ripple through our present. And if we listen closely, we can learn valuable lessons about who we are, our world, that constant human search for meaning and understanding.
And sometimes those echoes come to us in the form of these mysterious figures like David, whose work pushes us to question our assumptions, to see things from a different perspective, to dig deeper into the incredibly rich tapestry of human thought.
It's a great reminder that the journey of intellectual discovery, it never really ends. There are always new insights waiting to be found, new connections to be made, new mysteries to unravel.
It really is. It's like we get to build on what they figured out, try to see even further. And speaking of David's work, there was this one thing that really stuck with me. It was his description of the love for philosophical arguments as a kind of madness. It's such a powerful image and so unexpected, especially coming from someone who's often seen as a more, well, rational and logical thinker.
That's a really powerful quote. It suggests that for David, philosophy wasn't just about calmly seeking knowledge. It was this really intense, passionate engagement with ideas, driven by this deep desire to get to the heart of existence, to understand those fundamental truths.
It makes you wonder if he saw a connection between this madness, this philosophical passion, and the Christian idea of divine inspiration. Like, was he saying that philosophical inquiry, when it's done with real fervor, could lead to a kind of spiritual awakening or insight?
That's a really fascinating interpretation. It fits with his overall view of philosophy as this transformative experience, a path to spiritual enlightenment. And it reminds us that in late antiquity, the lines between what we might call religious and philosophical, they weren't always so clear.
It definitely challenges us to rethink our own ideas about how we come to know things, about the different ways we can access truth. Maybe faith and reason have more in common than we usually think.
I think you've touched on something really important there. David's work encourages us to explore those intersections, those places where different ways of knowing and experiencing the world might actually come together.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to bring up one more really interesting aspect of David's work. It's this idea that truly understanding philosophy isn't just about grasping the concepts intellectually. It requires a change in who we are, a transformation of the self. How does that idea play out in his philosophy?
David believed that genuine philosophical insight, it's not just about collecting facts or winning arguments. It involves a real shift in perspective, a reorientation of the soul toward the good. He argued that this transformation requires us to commit to living in accordance with reason and virtue, aligning what we do with what we understand about the true nature of reality.
So it's not just about thinking differently. It's about becoming different, embodying those principles we've learned through philosophical inquiry.
Exactly. And this emphasis on the power of philosophy to transform us, it echoes this ancient Greek concept of paideia. That was the process of education and self-cultivation that aimed to shape not just the mind, but the whole person.
It reminds us that philosophy isn't just something you study in school. It's a way of life, a journey of self-discovery and self-improvement, and it can really enrich and elevate our whole being.
And it's a journey that anyone can embark on, no matter what your background is or what you believe. All it takes is a willingness to engage with those big questions, to challenge your own assumptions, and to really strive for a deeper understanding of yourself and the world.
That's a wonderful thought to end on. So to everyone listening, we encourage you to keep exploring David's work, to wrestle with those challenging ideas, and to continue that journey of philosophical discovery that he so passionately embodied.
And may his work inspire us all to approach philosophy not just as a subject to study, but as a path to a richer, more meaningful life.
It's been a fascinating deep dive, and we hope you'll join us again next time as we explore more of the intriguing figures and ideas that have shaped our intellectual history. Thanks for listening.